And now for our final speaker of the conference. He is the founder of NutritionFacts.org, which has over 2,000 educational videos on pretty much any topic on nutrition that you could want. And over the last couple of years, we've learned how not to die, how not to diet, how not to age. And today he is answering a burning question on everyone's minds, and that is, what is the role of ultra-processed plant-based foods in our diet? Ladies and gentlemen, it is an absolute honor to welcome our final speaker, Dr. Michael Greger.
All right, wonderful. Hey! Welcome, everyone. I love this conference so much. So honored to be here. All right. There is no conference I'd rather be premiering a new talk for, so let's do this. Modern nutrition science began about a century ago in the context of nutrient deficiency diseases. So there were editorials with titles like Sugar as Food, heralding sugar as one of the cheapest sources of calories for mere 6 cents. You could buy 3,000 calories. What a bargain! But the nutrient deficiency era gave way to the dietary excess era. No longer were we dying of nutrient deficiency diseases like scurvy as much as we were dying from nutrient excess diseases like obesity and heart disease. So it became more about avoiding too many calories, too much saturated fat, too much sugar, too much sodium, but either way, still focused on nutrients. This allowed food companies to get away with abominations like frosting-filled cereal because it was fortified with 12 vitamins and minerals, 50% better than the measly 8 in Marshmallow Fruit Loops. However, food, not nutrients, is the fundamental unit in nutrition, and to their credit, the field of nutrition started moving towards a more holistic view. So, first-generation dietary guidelines emphasized individual nutrients. Moved on to second-generation food-based dietary guidelines, which largely converged on encouraging diets rich in what? Vegetables, fruits, legumes, your beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils, whole grains, and nuts. But an area of emerging importance was the degree of food processing. What if, when it comes to nutrition and health, it's not so much the food or the nutrients as much as the level of processing? For instance, a food-based dietary guideline might say something like, eat more vegetable soup. Great! But there's vegetable soup and then there's vegetable soup. Are we talking a clean out the fridge kind of vegetable soup? A health haloed quinoa and kale organic with a heart-stopping 1,200 milligrams of sodium? How about a vegetable soup with more salt than there are vegetables? Or a vegetable flavor soup that has more artificial colors and MSG than it has vegetables? Right? All soup is not the same. The degree of processing matters. Ultra-processed foods are these industrial formulations which, besides salt, sugar, oils, and fats, include substances that are really not used in cooking, like, added flavors and colors and artificial sweeteners, emulsifiers, other additives used to kind of imitate real foods, like, frosted grape Pop-Tart with more grapes on the front of the package than are actually in it, with less grapes than there are salt in the, but look, it may artificially taste like grapes and look like grapes because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different food dyes. Simply put, ultra-processed foods are foods that can't be made in a home kitchen because they've been chemically or physically transformed in these industrial processes. They typically contain little or no whole foods, are ready to consume and heat up, and are, fatty, salty, or sugary, and depleted in dietary fiber and other nutrients. So it's like all the, sweetened, fatty, salty snacks like potato chips and ice cream and soda, candy, French fries, burgers, hot dogs, chicken nuggets, fish sticks, basically everything in a box or a bag. Why not just call them, packaged foods? Well, they were actually thinking about it, but they were afraid that some consumers might look at a bag of apples or something and be like, get confused or something. Okay, but what is so revolutionary about this concept of ultra-processed foods? I mean, wasn't fatty, salty, sugary junk always a bad idea? Why isn't enough? Why is it not enough to just tell people to stay away from junk? Because Diet Coke. Diet soda is the perfect example why a new kind of term like ultra-processed can be so useful. Because it has no calories, no fat, no sugar, so no problem, right? Well, then why is diet soda consumption associated with premature death, stroke, heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, leukemia? And most studies controlled for body weight, so it's not just because heavier people are more likely to drink it. Health risks are not only related to the nutritional quality of ultra-processed foods, but also to the presence of additives, right? So no apparent calories, fat, sugar, salt, but contains caramel color, which results in the formation of 4-methylamidazole, which is a potential human carcinogen, and contains aspartame, also recently classified as possibly cancer-causing in humans, and contains phosphoric acid, which is a phosphate additive that may be damaging our health as well, and contains a benzoate preservative. Right? If you remove artificial colorings and benzoate preservatives from the diets of preschoolers and then randomize them to be slipped a placebo or a hidden cocktail of colors and benzoate, there's a significant reduction in hyperactive behavior when they got to remove these compounds, and then a significant increase in hyperactive behavior when they got the colorings and benzoate compared to getting the placebo. Now, of course, it could have been the colors and not the benzoate, but that's one of the problems. As little as we know about the effects of these individual additives, right, we know even less about what combinations of them can do. There's a large body of evidence suggesting toxicity from certain food colors, preservatives, sweeteners, and emulsifiers, in part sometimes through our gut microbiome. Now, industry apologists argue that the Food and Drug Administration carefully evaluates food additives to make sure that they're safe, of course, until they're not. In fact, to show the system works, they cite the removal of 6 carcinogenic artificial flavors in 2018. Artificial flavors that had been in the food supply approved for safety since 1964. So we were exposed more than 50 years before they were banned, and that's their example of the system working. Aspartame, right, NutraSweet, officially recognized as a potential human carcinogen in 2023, 42 years after the FDA's own public board of inquiry opposed approval based on it causing brain tumors in animals in the industry's own studies. This included several FDA scientists who didn't think it should be approved. The FDA commissioner, however, rejected these concerns, approved it anyway, before leaving the agency to enjoy a $1,000 a day consultancy position with the aspartame company's PR firm. And then the FDA actually prevented the National Toxicology Program from doing further cancer testing. And meanwhile, literally tens of millions of pounds made its way into the food supply. Remember when the food supplies thought partially hydrogenated oils was a good idea? Let's replace saturated fats with trans fats. Although many countries now restrict their use, trans fats continue to kill an estimated 500,000 people around the world every year. Of course, Saturated fat also is killing hundreds of thousands of people a year. But the point is that trans fats and partially hydrogenated oil killed people for decades before there were any limits on it. The FDA didn't ban it until 25 years after the first solid evidence that it increased the risk of heart disease. And meanwhile, every single one of those years, trans fats were killing an estimated 50,000 Americans a year. That is quite the death toll that can be laid at the feet of the ultra-processed food industry. But they originally thought it was safe. That's the problem. Right? Anytime a chemical company comes up with a new preservative or sweetener or artificial color, right, we have no idea how it's going to turn out decades later. So we can start to see the value of this ultra-processed food concept in which an entire category of foods is essentially kind of presumed guilty until proven innocent. Now, this drives the food industry crazy, but look at their track record. Look at the trail of bodies they've left behind. Now, okay, if additives are the problem, well then, why not just stick to so-called clean label foods made with simple, recognizable ingredients, no matter how the food is processed? Now, but that's assuming additives are the only other reason that ultra-processed foods may be unhealthy. Harmful additives are just one of the many ways ultra-processed foods have been linked to disease, right? I mean, at least the food additives are listed on the label, so we could avoid them if we wanted to. Unlisted are some of the sneakier ways ultra-processed foods may be unhealthy. Harmful additives are just one of the ways that ultra-processed foods have been linked to disease, like advanced glycation end products, for example. Increasing evidence has shown that the uptake of dietary AGEs, advanced glycation end products, closely related to the occurrence of many chronic diseases, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, osteoporosis, Alzheimer's disease. In fact, it is hard to find a single age-related disease not associated with AGEs. Dietary AGEs are abundant in highly processed foods because thermal treatments are commonly used. But, thermal treatment just means heat. So look, we can get AGEs from industrial processing or just from home cooking. So let's look at some examples. Canned corn has 20 units of AGEs per serving, compared to corn chips at 151, corn pops cereal 373. Right? Rice only has 9, but Rice Crackers 275 and Rice Krispies has 600. So you might be at the store and see some no salt added rice cracker or some no sugar added puffed rice cereal and be like, oh, great, right? This is just straight rice. Perfect. One ingredient, right? But no, because of the processing, it's not just that one ingredient. Boiled potato, 17 per serving. Potato chips, 865. Fast food fries, over 1,500. So ultra-processed plant foods can have nearly 100 times more of these toxins than minimally processed plant foods. But even raw, unprocessed animal foods start out with high levels and just go up from there. Instead of the 10 or 20 in cooked whole plant foods, fish, poultry, and meat start out at around 500 or more in their raw state, and then jump into the thousands once cooked, which is still considered minimal processing, though processed or ultra-processed meat can exceed 10,000 per serving. Although these contaminants are not limited to ultra-processed foods, you can see how just, considering foods based on their list of ingredients fails to capture how food processing can sometimes transform food at a molecular level. So it's clear that just using this kind of clean label strategy of sticking to foods with simple ingredients lists isn't going to cut it, since you're never going to read something like AGEs on a label. It's the processing itself, whether traditional or industrial, that's affecting the healthfulness of the food. In the latest dietary guidance document from the American Heart Association, they advise choosing minimally processed foods instead of ultra-processed foods. Now, of course, they're not telling people to eat a steak, which is considered minimally processed, because, of course, they're emphasizing we need to eat foods low in saturated fat and cholesterol. But just like there can be unhealthy, unprocessed foods, like steak, they suggest there may be some healthy, ultra-processed foods, like what about plant-based milk and meat substitutes? Admonitions against the consumption of products simply because they're classified as ultra-processed may impair society's acceptance of plant-based diets, thus preventing any of the related health advantages from being realized. And indeed, that does appear to be a significant reason why many people avoid these products. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Are plant-based alternatives healthier than conventional animal products? Let's find out. Food Compass is a nutrient profiling system that rates foods on a scale from 1 to 100, with 1 being least healthy, 100 being most healthy. 8,000 foods have been scored, so you can see where your favorite food falls. And when I have my laptop next to me, I ask people to yell out their favorite food, and we look up, see what the score is, and, they're all disappointed that their raspberry is only like a 93 or something, like, oh, whatever. But unfortunately, the laptop's in the back. But here are some examples of some perfect 100 foods, as well as foods that score the worst, all the way down from kale to Coca-Cola. Okay, so the main objective of ultra-processed fake foods is to imitate real foods, like strawberry Pop-Tarts, trying to imitate real strawberries. Well, when you start out with a perfect 100 food like strawberries, the only way to go is down. So, fruit is better than fruity-shaped marshmallows. But when the real food is ultra-processed meat, processed meat, or unprocessed meat or dairy, there's lots of room for improvement. So Food Compass has scored 9 ultra-processed meatless alternatives. Let's compare them to their closest conventional meat matches, and in every single case, plant-based meat was rated higher, healthier, sometimes by a large margin. Nearly all scored at least twice as high, or 3 times the health score, 7 times, 20 times, even 60-fold higher. Other common nutrient scoring systems all found the same general trend. Now, look, better than chicken would be chickpeas, and better soybeans than soy burgers. Soybeans are another perfect 100 food. But the choice on the Burger King menu is between this and that, not between this and that. Though, of course, there is a third choice, not ending up at Burger King. This was just a few products, though, just as an illustration. 2024 Systematic Review identified 9 studies using nutrient scoring systems for the assessment of more than 2,000 meatless alternatives and their meat matches, and all the studies, 9 out of 9, sometimes found comparable scores, but mostly showed meat alternatives score better. Based on their nutrient profiles, plant-based meats and milks will be expected to reduce chronic disease risk. When it comes to heart disease, stroke, and cancer, plant-based meats will be expected to decrease risk of these killer diseases by about 3% per daily serving replacement. Now, whole soy foods might take that down an extra 2% because they're not weighed down by the sodium issue. But overall, swapping in even just 1 serving of plant-based meat a day nationwide could potentially prevent more than 100,000 cases of heart disease, stroke, or cancer in the U.S. every year. Right? It's hard to get everyone to go all kale and quinoa overnight, but a veggie burger, right, should be easy. Right? 100,000 cases prevented every year. Single daily serving swap of plant-based meat. Now, that's just based on the respective nutrient makeup, saturated fat versus fiber, etc. But remember how not all the harmful effects of ultra-processed foods are necessarily captured by their nutrient profile. There are 16 proposed mechanisms linking ultra-processed foods to disease and death. And balance of nutrients is just one of those 16. And so using those 16 criteria, normally, when you compare ultra-processed products to the foods they were designed to replace, for example, water versus Kool-Aid, or fruit versus fruit-flavored candy, right? The ultra-processed product tends to do worse, and not just because of the junkier nutrient profile. However, plant-based meats appear to be the exception. Better in most ways compared to the foods they were designed to replace. We already covered nutrient profile, where plant-based meat tended to score healthier than regular meat based on every study using every major nutrient profiling system. I don't have time to go through all these right now. For those who want to dive a little deeper, I had a paper published this year on the subject. You're welcome to download. And actually this Thursday, the 21st, I'm going to be giving a 3-hour webinar where I delve through each of those criteria. And I've got a book on ultra-processed coming out this January, so I'll have all the references handy. But with limited time, I'm just going to skip through a bunch of these, so of course, happy to talk about them in Q&A. In terms of additives, I've been long concerned about red dye number 3, why it hadn't been banned from food, given that it had been banned over 30 years ago from anything going on our skin due to cancer risk. But it's still okay to eat? Thankfully, California passed a Food Safety Act set to ban red dye number 3 by 2027. So, in 2027, Loma Linda Big Franks will be illegal to sell in Loma Linda, but would still be available to potentially contribute to cancer risk throughout the rest of the country. But the FDA finally decided to ban it from food as well, 35 years after it was removed from cosmetics, starting in 2027 as well. So for now, this veggie bacon is considered too toxic to rub on your skin, but okay to eat, at least for the next 2 years. Why has the pork bacon industry figured out how to use cherry powder as a coloring before the plant-based bacon industry? The most harmful additive in plant-based meat is, ironically, really the most traditional, and that's salt, contributing to the number one dietary risk factor for death on planet Earth, excess sodium consumption. It is one of the most common ingredients in plant-based meat alternatives. Of course, also one of the most frequently used ingredients in conventional meat processing, and not just processed meat. While the number one source of sodium for kids in this country is pizza, and for older adults, bread, one of the reasons the number one source of sodium for those aged 19 through 50 in this country is chicken is because injecting raw chicken with salt water is a widespread practice in the poultry industry, something they've been doing since the 1970s, resulting in raw chicken breasts reaching as much as 400 milligrams of sodium or more, 6 times more than what they naturally have. When it comes to salt, how does meat and plant-based meat compare? Well, a systematic review found that the average levels of sodium not significantly different overall between plant-based meat and conventional meat, which is not great. But there are some products that are improving. When I created this chart 5 years ago for UBS, Beyond Meat burgers had 390 milligrams of sodium, which is in the typical 290 to 400 range of kind of regular American hamburgers. But the current version is 20% lower at 310, thanks to the use of potassium salt, potassium chloride instead of sodium chloride. And Impossible now has a beef light with only 260. Now, ideally, we'd be under 180, which would reach the World Health Organization's recommendation for less than a 1-to-1 ratio of sodium to calories. All the foods we eat ideally should have less sodium than calories. Plant-based meats tend to do better when it comes to some additives like carcinogenic nitrite preservatives, similar with salt and sugar, and worse with emulsifiers, which might be expected to hurt the gut microbiome. But vegetarians who eat plant-based meat actually end up with lower rates of irritable bowel syndrome than those who don't, which suggests that at least in that metric, emulsifiers don't seem to be a problem. In fact, all 3 studies on the impact of plant-based meat show microbiome benefits. For example, this randomized controlled trial analyzing stool samples before and after, even just swapping out 5 meals of meat a week for plant-based meat, confirming that even just the occasional replacement of meat may promote positive changes in the gut microbiome. In the second trial, the myco-meat study, people were randomized to replace a few servings of meat a day with the mycoprotein meat corn made from the mushroom kingdom rather than the plant kingdom. This swap not only increased the abundance of beneficial microbes in the gut, it reduced fecal genotoxicity, which is the amount of DNA damage that feces can cause colon cells. Now, that may just have been because they were cutting down on meat, right? But on the corn, there was a boost in good bacteria like lactobacillus, which may have benefits, suggesting that the fiber in microprotein may have this prebiotic potential. The 2-week swap did not seem to be long enough to affect TMAO levels, though, but in the 8-week Stanford swap meat study, in which 2 or more servings a day of beef, pork, or chicken were swapped out with plant-based beef, pork, or chicken, several cardiovascular risk factors improved, including TMAO, which stands for trimethylamine N-oxide, considered like the smoking gun of gut microbiome disease interactions. When we eat meat, dairy, or eggs, the carnitine and choline get turned by certain bad gut bugs into trimethylamine, which is oxidized by our liver into TMAO, which can then go on to damage multiple organ systems within our body. So, the cardiovascular harm from, eggs or meat is more than just the cholesterol and saturated fat. TMAO is linked to some of our deadliest diseases: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, stroke, cancer. Where are my nerds at? I don't know where are my nerds with really good vision at? If you look at check out those p-values. Those are my kind of p-values, like 6 times 10 to the negative 21st. That means you would only get a finding that extreme by chance if you ran the study 1 billion trillion times. So, TMAO may also mean time to minimize animal products, which we can do by switching to plant products. Plant-based meats can also be better for the upper digestive tract. If you randomize people to eat chicken, cheese, fish, and steak versus tofu, soy steak, seitan, and soy burgers, you see twice as much heartburn after the animal protein meal than after the plant protein meal. And you stick a probe down their throats, and after the animal products, you see 3 times as much acid exposure gurgling up from their stomach, reflexing up into their esophagus. The bottom line is that unlike any other ultra-processed product, plant-based meat appears to be the rare case, and with ultra-processed products are actually better overall than the foods they were designed to replace. Now, this probably says less how healthy they are and how really unhealthy modern meat is. Take, food safety, for example. In response to a Super Bowl ad placed by a meat industry-funded lobbying group questioning plant-based meat for its hard-to-spell ingredients, Impossible Foods responded with a parody, questioning an unintentional additive in conventional meat. Fecal contamination of the carcass in the slaughter plant is considered unavoidable. And though there are methods for removing kind of visible fecal contamination on meat, and even experimental imaging technologies designed to detect more kind of diluted fecal contaminations, we're still left at a retail level with guess what proportion of meat contaminated with fecal bacteria at the grocery store. About 85% of ground beef and turkey contaminated with fecal bacteria, and about half of chicken on store shelves, and a third of pork found contaminated with enterococci, which is used as a marker of fecal contamination in food. But you don't have to cook the crap out of plant-based meat because there shouldn't be any crap to begin with. Fecal contamination is not just unseemly, but really a critical public health issue. Fecal matter is considered to be the main source of some of the most serious foodborne pathogens like Salmonella and Campylobacter. Salmonella is the leading cause of foodborne hospitalizations in the United States, number one cause of foodborne death, and 1 in 4 packages of chicken sampled in the United States by the USDA contaminated with Salmonella. 1 in 8 packages of ground turkey, 1 in 24 packages of pork, 1 in 67 packages of ground beef, which is 1 in 4 packages of retail chicken. Campylobacter, which sickens more than 800,000 Americans a year, also found about 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 packages of retail chicken. Even just shopping for meat can be risky, as disease-causing fecal bacteria can contaminate the outer packaging of meat. But the good news is that foodborne illnesses are largely preventable, and the simplest approach to reduce their occurrence is to greatly reduce the consumption of animal products like meat. Look, they're intestinal bugs. And since plants don't have any intestines, we can reduce the risk with plant-based meat. Of course, is also, there's like manure runoff onto crops can be a problem. But the leading causes of large foodborne outbreaks of food poisoning, all meat. And every single one of the top 5 pathogen food combinations that cause the greatest burden of disease, all animal products, mostly meat. Now, that second one is toxoplasma, which is a brain parasite that may infect 1 million Americans a year, making it a leading source of severe foodborne illness in the United States. What may end up in your brain may start in your burger. Tapeworms in your brain from pork have become an increasingly important emerging infection in the United States. What you think is a migraine may not be a migraine. This is what they found in the brain of our current Secretary of Health and Human Services. You may even get bladder infections from eating meat, particularly poultry, urinary tract infections, or viral hepatitis from pork products, hepatitis E infection. There aren't any prions in plants either, the case of fatal spongiform brain diseases, which is why there's a mad cow disease and not a mad corn disease, right? And I didn't include other meat-borne pathogens like trichinosis or E. coli 015787, which still sickens 50,000 Americans a year, mostly from beef, or the 100,000 sickened from Yersinia-infected pork every year. But let's just stick to the major pathogens, some of which can become antibiotic resistant. Consuming contaminated meat with antibiotic-resistant bacteria is considered a severe public health hazard. To help compensate for the overcrowded, stressful, unhygienic conditions, animals raised for food are dosed en masse with antibiotics, lots of antibiotics. This is in kilos. So we're talking 10 million pounds a year of medically important antibiotics. So we give farm animals in the United States more than 1 million pounds of penicillin drugs a year, 4,000 tons of tetracyclines, right? Millions of pounds of drugs laced right into their food and water, antibiotics important to human medicine, being fed to cows, pigs, and chickens by the ton, by the thousands of tons every year. And so now in chicken breasts, for example, most of the Salmonella and Campylobacter found is now resistant to at least one class of antibiotics. About half of the Salmonella is resistant to 3 or more classes of drugs. Even organic meat raised without antibiotics can be contaminated with multi-drug resistant bacteria, often because of cross-contamination in the slaughter plant. It's funny, in the cover story of Consumer Reports that urged retailers to stop selling meats raised with antibiotics, they noted some store employee confusion. The assistant manager at one store, when asked by a shopper for meats raised without antibiotics, responded, wait, you mean like veggie burgers? Exactly. Antibiotic resistance genes can also be transmitted through meat, which can then transfer to pathogens in our own gut, as well as residues of the antibiotic drugs themselves, which is itself considered a serious public health threat. You can correlate. You want to know how much meat people eat? You can just measure the amount of antibiotics flowing out of their urine every day, right? These drug residues in the meat can cause allergies, nerve damage, liver damage, reproductive toxicity, bone marrow toxicity, even increased cancer risk, not to mention what eating antibiotics every day is doing to your gut microbiome. In contrast, the production of plant-based meat involves no guts, no feces, no antibiotics necessary. In addition to antibiotics, livestock may be fed or injected with hormones. Currently, 7 hormone drugs are approved by the FDA to bulk up the production of milk and meat. In Europe, there exists a total ban on all such use. But even without injected hormones, right, animal products naturally contain hormones because they come from animals. I already touched on processing contaminants, but there are also industrial contaminants that build up the food chain, like certain pesticides and PCBs, heavy metals, flame retardant chemicals that end up concentrating in meat. Can't you just choose organic meat? Surprisingly, the consumption of organic meat does not seem to diminish the carcinogenic potential associated with these industrial pollutants. If you look at the micropollutants and chemical residues of conventional versus organic meat, several environmental contaminants like dioxins and PCBs, lead, arsenic, sometimes measure significantly higher levels in the organic meat. Though cooking does draw off some of the fat where the PCBs are concentrated, seafood seems to be the exception, though, with steaming, for example, generally increasing the concentration of contaminants like mercury. There is, however, no mercury added to plant-based tuna. When researchers tested retail meat for the presence of 33 chemicals with calculated carcinogenic potential, like organochlorine pesticides like DDT and dioxin like PCBs, they concluded, in order to reduce our risk of cancer, we should limit our ingestion of beef, pork, or chicken to a maximum of 5 servings a month. Meat presents the only scenario in which ultra-processed products were designed to replace foods that we know cause cancer. In fact, the number 1 cancer killer of non-smokers, colorectal cancer. These are foods in desperate need of replacement. Processed meat, bacon, ham, hot dogs, lunch meat, sausage, considered a known human carcinogen, leading major cancer centers like Mount Sinai, Memorial Sloan Kettering, MD Anderson, to recommend flat out avoid processed meat. All in all, plant-based meat is better than animal-based meat in about 40 different ways. Now, obviously, some of these categories are more important than others. The fact that bacon is officially designated as cancer-causing is more important than the fact that it may have, a few more calories than plant-based bacon. But cancer is just killer number 2. The leading cause of death of men and women is heart disease. And hidden into that nutrient profile are the 3 things that raise LDL cholesterol: saturated fat, trans fat, and dietary cholesterol. Yes, there are other factors like TMAO, sodium, but LDL cholesterol, known as bad cholesterol, unequivocally recognized as the principal driver of atherosclerotic heart disease, our leading cause of death. Basically, we should try to get our LDL as low as possible. When it comes to LDL lowering, for the prevention of heart disease, lower for longer is better, even if your LDL is quote-unquote normal. Even if other heart disease risk factors are considered optimal, still of utmost importance to control. So, if LDL is the primary driver of our primary killer, if you could just know one thing about a food, if you could just ask one question, it would be, what does this food do to my LDL cholesterol? So we're looking at nutrition labels for saturated fat, trans fat, and cholesterol, since any intake above 0 increases LDL cholesterol and therefore increases our risk of coronary heart disease. In terms of saturated fat and cholesterol, animal meats are the main source in the American diet. And with the removal of partially hydrogenated oils in the U.S. food supply, such that these other sources are now banned, animal products are now the leading source of trans fats as well, since meat and dairy can naturally contain trans fats. Online, some bloggers parrot egg industry propaganda that the 2015 U.S. dietary guidelines removed its dietary cholesterol limit, whereas if anyone actually bothered to read the guidelines, they see that the guidelines actually strengthen the recommendation, telling Americans to eat as little dietary cholesterol as possible, as recommended by the Institute of Medicine, the most prestigious medical body in the United States. This advice was reiterated in the subsequent dietary guidelines. National Academies recommends that dietary cholesterol consumption be as low as possible. Now, while eggs are the most concentrated source of cholesterol, gram for gram, the greatest cholesterol contribution in the overall American diet is meat, including poultry and fish. Since cholesterol is present only in animal-derived foods, it's not surprising that plant-based meat has little or no cholesterol unless it has a little cheese or something added in it. And saturated fat content is usually low in plant-based meat compared to regular meat, averaging between 1/2 and 1/3. You can see that illustrated graphically here, where the conventional meat is those orange bars across the top. So better across the board, often by a large margin. This is as true in Europe as it is in South Africa and the U.S. Plant-based meat may only average, here in the U.S., only 1/3 of the saturated fat. Swapping out meat for plant-based meat significantly lowers saturated fat, but does this translate into lower LDL? That's what we really care about. Well, you don't really know until you put it to the... Exactly. Here's a meta-analysis of 10 randomized controlled trials, replacing some or all meat with plant-based meat or mycoprotein-based meat, and within an average of 6 weeks, saw a 15-point drop in LDL cholesterol. What does that mean in terms of disease risk? Maintaining a 15-point drop in LDL for 5 years is expected to decrease your risk of heart disease by about 10%, after a dozen years by more like 15%, and across a lifetime by more like 25%. And risk reduction is independent of baseline LDL, meaning you get about the same relative risk reduction, even if your LDL is so-called normal, right? Less than 100, right? One would also expect the use of egg substitutes to reduce cardiovascular risk, given that eggs are the most concentrated source of dietary cholesterol. What about substituting soy milk for cow's milk? Based on 17 randomized controlled trials, drinking soy milk instead of cow's milk resulted in significant improvements in blood pressure, in cholesterol, in inflammation, an 8-point drop in systolic blood pressure, 5-point drop in diastolic blood pressure, 7-point drop in LDL cholesterol, switching to soy, as well as a drop in C-reactive protein, so less inflammation as well. Over a lifetime, that 7-point drop in LDL could drop our risk of heart disease by more than 10%, just making that single dietary swap from cow to soy. Now, the benefits only accrue if your cholesterol stays down, and it turns out it may even get better. In a 4-year study in which diabetics were randomized to swap out half their animal protein for ultra-processed plant protein, their LDL went down year after year, ending up 26 points lower than the control group. All right, that could net like a 40% drop in risk over a lifetime of our number one killer, just swapping out half of their animal protein servings. An estimated 20 million Americans have heart disease, having about 800,000 heart attacks a year. I mean, if we started swapping out animal products for plant products, right, imagine how many lives could be saved by even a 10% drop in heart disease. Now, instead of swapping out a burger for a veggie burger, why not just switch to chicken and fish? Because it doesn't work. A meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials that compared the cholesterol effects of beef versus poultry and/or fish found no significant difference in terms of LDL. And an updated meta-analysis of 4 times as many studies also found no benefit to switching to chicken and poultry. And the beef was actually found to be better than the fish. which they attribute to using particularly lean cuts of beef as the comparator, particularly because the beef industry is the one that funded these studies. But even organic grass-fed beef appeared to be no match for plant-based meat, as shown in the Stanford swap meat trial. With processed meat, officially classified as a known human carcinogen, global public health authorities flat out recommend avoid processed meat. But looking at 6 health outcomes, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, ischemic heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and 2 types of stroke, the optimal amount of unprocessed red meat may be 0 as well. But even a 30% reduction in both types of meat could lead to 1 million fewer cases of type 2 diabetes, hundreds of thousands of fewer cases of cardiovascular disease, tens of thousands fewer cases of cancer and premature death over a decade. Diets high in processed meat and red meat are also the 2 leading causes of diet-related disability in the United States, responsible for more than 1 million years lived in disability annually, 3 times more than diets high in sugar-sweetened beverages, for example. And more than 2 million years of healthy life lost, based on the most comprehensive analysis of risk factors and disability in history. Millions of years of life lost in the United States because people are eating diets high in red and processed meat. Okay, yeah, but what do they define as high, though? A diet high in processed meat is defined as any intake of processed meat. And a diet high in red meat, high as in any intake of red meat. So millions of years of life lost in the United States because people are eating more than 0 red and processed meat. Now, higher intake of meat in general, red meat, white meat, processed meat, unprocessed meat, also associated with increased risk of death from all causes put together. If people swapped out 75% of their meat, up to 50,000 lives be saved, high-income countries. Okay, what would happen if the whole world cut out all meat? We would save an estimated 7 million lives a year. And if humanity cut out all animal products, we might annually save 8 million lives, hanging in the balance. The bottom line is that veggie burgers are not Twinkies, even though they're both classified as ultra-processed foods. Now, there are 2 directions we can go with that fact. We can decry the very concept of ultra-processed foods, or we can take what I would argue is a better tact, and that is keep the baby, throw out the bathwater. In other words, not deny that ultra-processed foods tend to be worse, not deny that plant-based meats are ultra-processed, but rather that despite this classification, plant-based meats and milks are the rare exception, and that they compare well with the foods that are designed to replace them, in some cases potentially even saving thousands of lives. But there is some merit to the argument that this ultra-processed concept is not as useful as many people think. If you look at the 3 big Harvard cohorts, 200,000 people followed for decades. Yes, total ultra-processed food intake associated with cardiovascular risk. But if you break it down, the risk is driven exclusively by soda and meat, sugar-sweetened beverages, a little from artificially sweetened beverages, and the rest from processed meat, poultry, fish. If you exclude soda and meat, the relationship between ultra-processed food and cardiovascular disease disappears completely. So nutritional advice for cardiovascular health should consider the differential consequences of group-specific ultra-processed foods, and specifically that means processed meats and soft drinks should be discouraged. What about mortality? Yes, those who ate the most processed foods in general, higher risk of dying prematurely, but it mattered what kind of ultra-processed foods, with ready-to-eat meat, poultry, and seafood products showing particularly strong associations with mortality. The apparent worst ultra-processed food when it comes to dying prematurely in general, meat, poultry, seafood. The worst when it comes to dying from cancer, meat, poultry, seafood. The worst when it comes from dying from cardiovascular disease, meat, poultry, seafood. The worst when it comes to dying from lung diseases like emphysema, meat, poultry, seafood. The worst when it comes from dying from neurodegenerative diseases, ice cream. And the worst when it comes to dying from other causes, meat, poultry, seafood. Bottom line, the major factors contributing to the harmful effects of ultra-processed foods and mortality are processed meat, fish, poultry, and soda. So the negative life-shortening effects of ultra-processed food is really just talking about the negative life-shortening effects of ultra-processed meat, like burgers, chicken nuggets, and fish sticks. Right? Now, ideally, we'd have a study that specifically looked at meat alternatives, and here we go. 250,000 people followed for over a decade, and while the higher consumption of ultra-processed foods in general increased the risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, but that was driven by ultra-processed animal products and soda, not plant-based meats. They specifically studied plant-based meat alternatives, found no increased risk. And when it comes to diabetes, plant-based meat and milk appears to cut the risk of developing diabetes in half. Animal-based products were associated with more than twice the risk. Plant-based alternatives with less than half. So when the authors conclude that higher consumption of ultra-processed foods may increase the risk of cancer and other diseases, the data really only shows that the consumption of foods of animal origin and soft drinks is associated with such risk. And indeed, when the authors were challenged to go back and exclude animal foods and beverages, the relationship between ultra-processed foods and multiple diseases disappears. That's also what a systematic review and meta-analysis of all such studies showed. The only categories of ultra-processed foods associated with higher mortality was sweetened beverages and meat. So wait, if the only ultra-processed food that appears to be killing people is meat, then in that case, instead of being part of the problem, plant-based meat may be the solution to the ultra-processed problem, right? Let me say that again. Instead of being part of the problem, plant-based meats may be the solution to the ultra-processed problem. The one other ultra-processed study that separated out plant-based meat looked at telomere length, which is used to measure cellular aging. Their study found that, higher consumption of total ultra-processed foods associated with shorter telomere length, a sign of accelerated aging. However, some subclasses of ultra-processed foods were associated with longer telomere length, suggesting slower aging. And the class of foods associated with the longest telomeres, vegetarian alternatives, plant-based meat. The most important question in all nutrition may be, compared to what, right? The effects of any given food depend on what that food is being compared against. So is plant-based meat healthy? Well, compared to the animal products it's intended to replace, absolutely, right? Plant-based meat alternatives are more healthful than the meat they replace, but perhaps less so than the whole plant foods, such as legumes and whole grains. Wait, just perhaps less so? This is how ultra-processed plant meat compares to meat. This is how unprocessed plants compare to meat. Not only making up for all the shortfalls, but if we add an even better category, whole plant foods do even better in many categories. For example, bean-based meat averages 5 times less saturated fat than their meat comparators, but actual beans have 40 times less. Okay? Half the trans fat or no trans fat. 5 grams of fiber, certainly better than 0, but hey, 9 grams is even better. And there are interventional trials demonstrating the greater benefits, for example, in terms of fighting insulin resistance and inflammation. So certainly whole plant foods for the win, but plant-based meat alternatives, they're not designed to replace whole plant foods. Instead, to offer a stepping stone in the transition away from meat. I like to think of it as like meat methadone, right? Or as Professor Gardner put it, right, hoping that plant-based meats will be the gateway drug to legumes, right? This is how the transition to healthier diets is envisioned, from the global burden of disease to the global relief of disease, as people use plant-based and mycoprotein-based meats to transition towards a more whole food plant-based diet. With the added saturated fat and sodium, plant-based meats are not healthy, but they are healthier. They are healthier than the foods they were designed to replace. They are better, but not the best. Yes, nutrition policies and dietary guidelines, the bottom line, they should continue to emphasize diets rich in whole plant foods. Indeed, if all meat in high-income countries were replaced with whole legumes, we could potentially decrease the overall mortality rates by 5 or 6%. That means saving 180,000 lives in the United States every year. If instead we replaced meat with processed or ultra-processed plants, we'd only save about 130,000 Americans every year. About a 4% drop in overall mortality, right? That's still over 100,000 people saved every year, right? So we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Plant-based meat alternatives are better than the alternative, or as one study put it, plant-based meat can be considered meat with benefits. Thank you so much.
Wow. What a way to end the conference. That was absolutely phenomenal. I think he deserves another round of applause. All right. Dr. Greger, do you have time for two questions?
Let's do it.
All right. So on one of the slides that you just ended on, there was, right at the bottom, it spoke about mold toxins being higher in plant-based meats. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so there's mycotoxins. So I have a bunch of videos on mycotoxins that affect the majority of the food crops grown in the world today. And although animals that eat contaminated, moldy food crops can build up these mycotoxins, like aflatoxin, the plant products tend to have higher levels in general. So the concern is, so there was a modeling study in Europe that suggested that if everybody switched from their current meat consumption to 100% plant-based meat, the mycotoxin exposure, the increased mycotoxin exposure that they get based on studies of hundreds of plant-based products would cause between 1 in 1 million or 1 in 2 million more cases of liver cancer because of the aflatoxin content. So one in 1 or 2 million people would get liver cancer that wouldn't have gotten liver cancer if they'd stuck with the meat. Of course, the amount of colorectal cancer that would be prevented by switching to plant-based meat would far overwhelm that 1 in a million case or 1 in 2 million cases. Having said that, it's still not acceptable, right? I mean, so these plant-based companies. So I encourage. So in the book, I talk about how really they should be tested. You can test for your feed, the soy or whatever you're using in your products, and you just make sure that they don't reach levels that could cause any harm, right? We don't just want overwhelming benefit over harm. How about overwhelming benefit with no harm? And so, unfortunately, mycotoxins is one of the things that is actually lower. The concern is lower in meat, but still overwhelming for trying to prevent cancer, overwhelmingly. But that doesn't make plant-based meat companies off the hook, and I encourage them to start testing to make sure that they indeed drop their levels lower.
And a question that actually stumped Dr. Christopher Gardner earlier.
Bring it.
You have to answer in one word.
One word.
What is your favorite plant-based ultra-processed food after all this research that you've done?
He couldn't answer? What?
It took him a while.
What did he finally say? Well, no, don't. Well, okay, this is actually controversial, whether it's actually considered ultra-processed. But, so tempeh. Some regard that as an ultra-processed product because some you can't really make in your home kitchen because they use these, fancy processes. You actually can make tempeh, but it's quite a process. And if you read the instructions for making tempeh, it's like, if there's black mold, that's fine. But if it's gray mold, then you don't want it, it's like, I'll let you make it. But that's an example of a processed product that's actually healthier than the whole food. So the whole food soybeans, and then they process it by adding these mycoprotein threads, these cultures, and they ferment it into tempeh. So it actually it's a rare processed product that's actually healthier than just the regular whole food. It has more spermidine, more glutathione, all sorts of things. So I love that as there's a processed product I can get behind. You're actually processing it to make it healthier, and that's unfortunately all too rare.
Dr. Gardner said soy milk.
Oh.
Not sure which one was better. Are we allowed to know the title of your new book that's coming out?
Yes. So I've got three books coming out this year, 3 books next year. October 10th is the cholesterol lowering book. And then in January will be the ultra processed book. It's got some boring title like ultra processed foods, controversies, concerns, and accept, something like that. But it basically goes through all the criteria and just has all the references. So you can use this as a reference book. And this Thursday, I'll be doing a 3-hour webinar. So basically, I'll be giving a 3-hour version of this presentation. If you thought this presentation was too long, imagine adding 2 hours to this presentation. I mean, so I skip through all those. It's like, okay, well, let's not skip through it. So I talk about the mycotoxins. I talk about everything. So I go through. So if you really want to do the deep dive, this Thursday, you can watch the extended version.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much. Another round of applause.